We're going to be recording today's event, we'll be able to refer back to this afterwards and also share the benefits of today's presentation beyond everyone who's able to be here today. It's Thursday, February 25th, and today we've come together to hear from Rachel Knight from Namati's Community Land Protection Program. She'll be talking for about 30-40 minutes about our new publication, Supporting Communities to Document and Protect Their Land Rights, a new step-by-step guide for facilitators. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. The most important thing for me at this as facilitator is to make sure that you are able to use our webinar system, which is actually quite straightforward. As you'll see, there's a control panel and the presentation window where you should be seeing Rachel's first slide. The control panel provides you with a few features. The most important one is that you can ask questions. And there's a questions box. You can click into that spot where it says type question here, and you'll be able to put in your questions for Rachel, and also communicate with the organizers. We have Marina Brinkhurst, also from the Community Land Protection Program, who will be fielding questions and passing them along to Rachel at different points during the presentation. And then so feel free to type in your questions and communicate with Marina directly in that questions box. You also have the ability to raise your hand and lower your hand. And we'll also be asking you to do that from time to time to confirm that you're able to hear us and that there aren't any problems. Actually, right now, can you please go ahead and click the button to raise your hand to confirm that you're able to hear what I'm saying? That's terrific. I'm seeing many raised hands. And by the way, I'm looking at the attendee list. We have 49 people attending so far. I'm super happy with the attendance. I'm so excited to have so many of you here. I'm going to go ahead and lower your hands now. Thank you very much for doing that. And now I'd also like to test out the questions box and also take this opportunity to learn a little bit about everyone who's here. Can you please go ahead and use the questions box to tell us where you are coming from? And I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Excellent. So we're seeing from Vivek Vivek Maru, the head of Namati. He's in Washington, D.C. and attending. We have many people coming from all over the world. We have the UK, Canada, and Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, Uzbekistan, Mozambique, Kenya, more from Sierra Leone. We have many organizations, South Africa, we have many, Uganda again. We have many people from all over the world representing many different organizations. Thank you all for also indicating your organizations. That's quite interesting. We have Rights and Resources Initiative, Mokoro in England, International Accountability Project, and Nature Conservancy in Washington, D.C., Landesa here in Seattle, where I'm based as well, Rights and Resources Initiative. So I'm super excited. Many other different organizations, even more responses coming in. So thank you very much for doing that. I'm able to see that we have good attendance. and that the world is well represented. Very exciting. So I would like to now go ahead and hand over to Rachel Knight, who's going to introduce herself and start her presentation. Thanks so much. Rachel, why don't you go ahead and start your presentation.
Thank you so much, Tobias. Good morning, everybody. Hi. It's very strange for me to be giving a large presentation from my home. It's 7 a.m. here in California. And so from this morning, I know it's probably late at night in other parts of the world, but thank you so much for attending. It's truly an honor. So I'm going to start the webinar, and I'm going to talk for around 30 to 35 minutes. I want to begin by just giving extraordinary gratitude to our first partners. We started this work 7 years ago together, and it's been an incredible process of innovation and confronting challenges and finding solutions. And I want to honor the Sustainable Development Institute in Liberia, the Land and Equity Movement in Uganda, and Centro Terra Viva in Mozambique. So much of this work that I'm going to be talking about today comes from the incredible dedication and brilliance of the frontline advocates of these organizations who are working on the ground in the communities. And I just want to presence them first before I begin. So very quickly, the origin of the community land protection process. It started from 2009 to 2011. It was originally a 60 community randomized control experiment in Uganda, Liberia, and Mozambique. The questions we were asking ourselves were, first and foremost, how do we support communities to document and protect their land rights before they're dispossessed by government mega projects, international investors, and corrupt national elites? A lot of in the places we were working, there were good laws on the books to actually allow communities to document their land rights, but in many ways they hadn't been well or widely implemented. So we were asking, how can we actually empower communities to follow national laws to claim their rights? And the second question we were asking back then was, how do we support communities to create internal mechanisms to protect the land rights of women and minority groups? As many of you well know, there's often incredible discrimination within communities of women, marginalized groups, widows, orphans, etc. Strangers is what outsiders, what they call them in some parts of West Africa. And often those people have the least secure land rights. So the questions were, how can we support communities to really look internally to create systems to protect these groups' rights? After the randomized control trial ended, we started an international scale-up and continued learning. We're now working in 7 countries with 9 partners in over 150 communities. And the process that's in this guide that we're going to talk about today, it was developed with our partners at every step by first and foremost listening to communities' needs and desires. Along the way, communities were very clear about, we want this, we don't want to do this, this is what would be helpful to us. And also watching where they had challenges and where they were innovating the most incredible solutions. And our partners along the way were also asking ourselves the same thing. We were always gathering and analyzing data. One of the staples of Namati's work is to do rigorous monitoring and evaluation and intensive critical reflection on a very regular basis. So we were always seeing what was working, what wasn't working, making improvements, critically reflecting on challenges. And then the really interesting thing that I want to bring out is that it was really extraordinary to see that sometimes forest-dwelling people in Liberia would be having a problem that was solved by pastoralist communities in Uganda. And sometimes the people in Liberia that would then figure out a different solution that would be helpful to fisher folk in Mozambique. And so by working in 3 different places and now 7 different places with such a wide range of communities, what one community would innovate or what one partner would innovate, we could then cross-pollinate to our network of partners. And so it became this very fruitful exchange across cultures and contexts with people sharing and innovating solutions. So what came about over these 7 years was actually something pretty beautiful, which is that not only are we working to protect and defend land rights, but the questions have also come to be, rather than just fighting to protect, how can we also be building more democratic, participatory local governance systems, How can we support sustainable local economies that lead to authentic community prosperity? How can we support communities to regenerate their ecosystems and make their lands into arcs of biodiversity as we head into climate change? And how can we support the maintenance and revitalization of diverse cultures and traditions? So the idea is we're not only fighting and defending and protecting, but we're creating something beautiful for future generations along the way. The Facilitators Guide came about through our realization that global grabbing trends are immense. The scale of the problem is vast, and Namati and its few partners cannot address this well enough by ourselves. So we created this guide as a tool that advocates around the world can use to support communities to document and protect their lands. The idea is that now every single thing we've learned and know is on paper. Every single thing we know is in that book. So Namati is, we're offering it to you to do as you wish with it and as you can with it. Every chapter includes exercises, sample forms, tips from advocates, and it's designed to be adaptable to any culture, any legal context, and to each community's particular goals. So the idea is that with this guide, you should call Namati. We have a lot of technical expertise to offer, of course, but hopefully thousands of communities around the world can, through this guide, be empowered to proactively document their lands and strengthen local governance. So an overview of the process, and this is actually the overview of the rest of the presentation, is I'm going to take you through the 5 steps we've worked out. And these 5 steps are the best simplification of this process as we can describe it. And each of these steps has a number of activities, as I'm sure you can see from the table of contents in the guide that hopefully you've all downloaded by now. So step 1 is laying the groundwork. Step 2 is strengthening community governance of land and natural resources. Step 3 is harmonizing boundaries and documenting community land. Step 4 is completing government registration procedures. And step 5 is preparing communities to prosper. So there are some key principles underlying the whole community land protection process in the guide. The first one is this process is meant to be adapted to the local context and each community's goals. We use the word should a lot in the guide simply as shorthand, but it should not be taken as a must. The idea is that we printed this to be a binder, and NGOs around the world can take out chapters they don't like or add new things they do want to add in there, or move the chapters around and move the activities around in an order that they think is best for their situation. And we really want to urge that every NGO that takes up this process can adapt it and make it as flexible as necessary to the local context. The second key principle is that we found in that randomized control trial from 2009 to 2011 that this process absolutely needs paralegals to be the link between the NGO facilitators and the community. So I'm going to sort of go quickly over this in the next section of the presentation, but we call paralegals community land mobilizers. And we found that every community needs these land mobilizers to help support the process forward, and also to elect coordinating committees to make sure that everyone in the community has a representation in the interim structure of the community land protection process. And the interim coordinating committee is necessary to make sure that diverse community participation happens. The idea is that every stakeholder group, women, youth, minorities, people of every religious and ethnic origin who live in that community should be taking part and actively speaking. And by that we mean not just showing up at meetings, but actually participating and giving their views. And finally, the most important key principle is that bylaws drafting and the governance piece is the heart of the community land protection process. If the community is just mapping its lands and submitting requests for documentation, it's really not going to go to the heart of how do we actually improve community governance over lands and resources. And I'll speak about that later in the presentation. So before we get into the process, some suggested best practices, which are carefully detailed in the first section of the guide. Choosing the community carefully. One thing we've learned over the years is that it's absolutely critical to make sure that communities very much want to protect their lands. One of the bases of our work is that the community should be actively requesting this work, to asking the NGOs, saying, please come help us. We'd really like to do this work. And so we ask our partners, and I would suggest to all of your organizations, not to go into communities and say, okay, we've got this project, do you want it? But to use video, use all kinds of media to say, we have this project, please contact us if you want to do this. And fill out this application and jump through these hoops to show that you're truly motivated. And then to go into the community and look to make sure that it's a healthy community, that it has strong leaders that are not corrupt, that it has a track record of working together to realize goals, that it's not bound up in massive internal conflict and power struggles between leaders. Because what we've found is if you start this process in an unhealthy or dysfunctional community, and then because of its dysfunction, it doesn't make it all the way through to the end, we may leave the community in a worse situation than started. So it's absolutely critical to choose eager, motivated, and well-organized, healthy communities to do this with. Second, the logistics of this work are very challenging. There's a lot of communities to visit, there's a lot of meetings, there's a lot of coordination and communication, there's many moving parts. And so our partners over the years have innovated absolutely fantastic project management solutions that are in the chapter on project management. So I urge you to look at that closely. Again, full participation by women and minority groups, that is absolutely critical. And so throughout the book there are many tools and tips about special meetings to convene, particularly for women and members of minority groups, and ways to make sure they're involved, ways to highlight their expertise, highlight the usefulness of their participation, and to slowly but surely weave them into questions of land governance so that by the end of the process, women, youth, members of minority groups are a critical piece and part and parcel of land governance in that community. Another piece that I cannot highlight strongly enough is the importance of working with existing leaders. What we found is that leaders might be like, yes, we want to document our land, we need a map, we need title. But along the way, the governance work is actually setting the community up to have much more participatory governance and actually to change the structure of land governance in the community. And so we've found that it's absolutely necessary to work with the existing leaders and make sure they understand that that is one of the key goals of the work, and to make sure they have buy-in and support for that goal from the very beginning. And we really detailed that it can be quite a challenge, so it's quite detailed in the guide. Finally, we learned along the way a couple of more things. First of all, that this community land protection process is an extraordinary vehicle for helping the community to preserve and revitalize its culture. We realize that community empowerment is not just about governance and rules and taking active part in this process. It's actually a huge piece of it is helping the community become empowered by returning to their roots and returning to their traditions and finding pride in their dances and their songs and their music, and using all of those beautiful internal drivers to support community unity and motivation and human dignity. And then finally, the process can go on for a very long time. Sometimes it takes 9 months, sometimes it takes 2 years, depending on how long the community wants to go for. And so the question becomes, how do we set clear ideas with the community about when the NGO is going to exit and decide that the work is done? So we have a chapter on setting clear roles and rules and decisions with the community about when to leave and declare the work over. So I'm going to talk about step 1, laying the groundwork, and then we're going to take a break for questions, because I'm going pretty fast, so I will just get your questions ready. There'll be a moment soon. So this laying the groundwork phase came about from the challenge of how do we organize and motivate the entire community. And so we developed slowly over time this 6-part process. It's about going into the community and explaining the entire community land protection process from start to finish, and then working with leaders and community members to figure out how to define the community. And for those of you who work in this field, I'm sure it's quite obvious that what is a community? How do you define a community? The community might have 30 definitions within itself about who belongs and who doesn't belong, who is included, who is excluded. And so it needs to be a highly participatory process about deciding what are the definitions of the community. And what we suggest is that the community define itself spatially according to territory, and then that the facilitators mandate or work with the community very strongly to say that anyone who lives within that spatial territory as their primary residence is included as a member of that community. And then there are seasonal users and people with historical use rights and people who may own land in that community but live elsewhere but go there to do their livelihoods. Those are questions the community has to grapple with and come to conclusions about by itself. But we strongly urge that the people who make their primary residence within the spatial definition of community are included, and also that people with historical use rights are very much included as well. We then lead communities through a visioning exercise, evaluation exercise, which I'll explain in a minute, and then establishing terms of engagement to make clear what the rules and the roles are. What are the responsibilities of the NGO that the community is going to hold them accountable to? And what are the rules and the responsibilities and the roles of the community that the NGO is going to hold the community accountable to? For example, if you're going to cancel a meeting, let us know 24 hours in advance so we don't drive all the way out there and waste all that petrol. Or if the facilitators say they're going to come at 12, don't come at 3 in the afternoon while the community's been waiting for 3 hours. So establishing clear rules and roles to make sure that everything runs smoothly. And then finally, selecting and training the community land mobilizers and the coordinating committees. So the visioning process evolved to really help the community get motivated. And a lot of different organizations have visioning processes, so I'll just go quickly. But in this process, it's one of the very first activities we do with communities, and it involves asking the community to sit and sometimes even close their eyes and remember the past. And so the communities remember the past, and oftentimes the elders will say, there was abundant firewood, we could just go out and pick it up in 5 minutes, or we had traditional dances and rites of passage rituals for our children, for our teenagers, and there was, you could go and all the waters were perfectly clean, and you could pick all the fruits and vegetables you needed in the common area. And they get very nostalgic, and they describe this often quite utopian past. And then we ask them to think about the present and just sit quietly and think about that for a minute. And then we ask people to describe the present, and they often say things like, there's not enough resources, our waters are not as clean as they used to be, people are fighting for everything, it's every family for themselves, and we've lost some of our traditions, etc. And then we ask them to think about the likely future if nothing changes. And at that moment, there's often a very intense silence that descends on the group, and they start thinking about what the future will be like for their children and grandchildren. And people sometimes get extremely emotional. And then finally we say, okay, now what is the future you want to see? What is the future you want to leave for your children and grandchildren? And then people start to brainstorm about clean water, abundant natural resources, community collaboration. And then we start linking this vision that they have with the community land protection work and saying, okay, we're about to take you through a very intensive multi-activity process that's going to take a lot of time and energy on your part, but we're going to be working towards that desired future. And it often makes a profound impact on the community and really increases participation. The second activity that we've found has been transformative for motivating communities and ensuring very widespread communication is a evaluation exercise that we innovated in response to the fact that we were finding the communities were still very excited to have an investor come and pay them rent for use of their common lands. In one particular case, we had a community that had gone all the way through our process, and the leaders still were delighted to have this deal where the investors offered them $2 per acre for 10,000 acres, and they were thrilled. They're like, wow, that's $20,000 a year. We're going to get super rich. This is fantastic. And so we thought, how do we get this across very quickly that they're losing far more than they understand? So we do this quick 2-hour exercise where all you need is a pen and a paper, a big pen and a paper, a big piece of paper, and ask communities to take out their cell phones and use their calculator function. So we convene a large meeting quite early in the process, and we ask communities to brainstorm a list of all the resources they get from their common forest or their grazing land. And they say things like firewood, meat from hunting, fish, like a herbal medicine, honey, thatch for our homes. And so we write it all down, and we make this chart that's here on my screen. And we say, okay, just for example, so how much how much firewood does one family on average use per day? And they say, okay, it's a bundle, 4 or 5 pieces of logs. And so we say, okay, so you use one bundle per day. If you couldn't gather that firewood from the forest, how much would it cost to buy that bundle in the local market? And people will say, okay, one US dollar. So, and then we say, okay, so if one family uses a bundle per day, that means, and the bundle is 1 US dollar, it means that one family would need to spend 365 US dollars annually to buy firewood that you currently get for free from your forest. And people start to say, oh, and then we say, how many families are there in your community? Oh, we have 1,000 families in our community. Okay, so if you have 1,000 families and each family is spending $365 a year on firewood that you currently get for free, that means that your community is getting $365,000 worth of firewood from your forest. And then we go through and we do this for all of the resources they've listed. And by the end, it often comes close to $1 million US a year in value that they're getting from their forests or their grazing lands. And that's when people get really excited or really upset. And they say things like, oh my God, it's our free community supermarket. Or they say, we're looking at gold and calling it a rock. Oh, sorry, we're looking at gold and calling it a rock. And then in the communities that have already leased their land to an investor or sold some of their land, this incredible sense of grief comes up, and they get very angry with their leaders for making such decisions and basically depriving them of this massive resource that is literally sustaining the survival and welfare of all the communities all the families in the community. So I'm going to stop there because I've been talking for a while and open the floor to questions.
So there are already quite a few questions that have been posed through the questions box. Encourage everyone to go ahead and type in their questions, and we'll try to address as many of them as possible. In the meantime, Marina, would you like to share some of the questions that were asked with Rachel?
Sure. Okay. So starting with our first question, Rachel, Dela was asking, how do you assess if communities are actually ready and eager to do this work? How do you make that decision?
As I said, we ask communities. Oh, sorry. Should I wait for all of them, or should I respond?
We can go one by one.
Okay. As I said, we have. And Marina, can you help me by pointing out the page number in the guide where we talk about this? But we have a series, we've included both a community application sample form that asks communities to literally fill out quite a 3-page extended form about, how do their leaders work together, do they have a track record of coordinating and collaborating on projects, why do they want to protect their lands, and asking at least all of their leaders to sign to say we are unanimous in agreement that we want to pursue this work. And then we also have a form we developed that the NGOs and the facilitators can go in to do their own assessment of whether the community is actually ready and willing and able. And that's often done just by speaking with leaders, speaking with community members, talking often to other NGOs that have already worked in the community or to local government officials that know the community. For example, we did work in one community in Mozambique where no matter what we did, the community could not get organized. The leaders were fighting among themselves. There was intense corruption. And so finally we talked to the local district officials, and they were like, oh, that community is a disaster. It's a mess. We've known that for years. And so we learned very quickly, that was very early on, that was back in like 2009, we learned quickly that it's absolutely critical to speak to as many people as possible who know the community. And there's quite a long chapter on that, so I'll stop there.
That's great, and I've noted in the questions box the page to view that in the guide. It's page 21. So our next question comes from Janae Poe at the Rights and Resources Initiative, and Janae asks, by paralegals, do you mean internal members of the community who understand legal context for titling land? So perhaps we could explain a little bit more who these paralegals are.
Sure. Numati's, the bread and butter of Numati is we're a legal empowerment organization. We promote the use of paralegals everywhere all the time to increase access to justice. and I would love for, I could speak quite at length about how fantastic paralegals are. Most paralegals around the world are highly trained, like legal experts who go through certification classes, etc. In our program, we find that it's absolutely necessary to have at least two, no, but somewhere between 2 and 3 trained community members. So they're not paralegals in the professional sense, but they're more two or three community members who have a track record of strong leadership and respect in the community, who can be trained by the facilitating organization to take a leadership role and learn about national laws and be the eyes and ears of the facilitating organization in the community, and also be the link between the community and the facilitator. So if a legal question comes up, the paralegals can answer it, or they can quickly get on the phone with the facilitating organization and say, here's what's coming up, what should we do, do you have an answer here? So we use the reason we call them community land mobilizers is that they are trained community members and not professional paralegals.
Okay, our next question is from Aileen Omosa, and Aileen asks, in relation to definition of community, how does one deal with community members who reside and work somewhere else, for example, urban areas, and yet are very influential in decisions made by regular residents and resource users? It's common in most communities in Africa. We live and work in urban areas, but are very much members of our rural communities.
That is an excellent question, and I would love if there's like time for discussion to really probe that. It's a constant challenge for us, to be honest, is that we'll be doing all this fantastic work in a community, and the community will be united and excited to document their land, and then some son of the soil who moved to the capital city will come back and be like, wait, no, and completely disrupt the process, and be like, and they will be highly respected by the community because they left, they got an education, they make a lot of money, or they're an elite businessman, and they'll come back and say, well, this is all a very bad idea, we need to privately title everything, or something like that. And so it's a huge challenge for us. On the flip side, sometimes those people who grew up in the community and moved to the capital can actually be huge resources and have a lot of knowledge and expertise and connections that can actually help the community. But the majority of the time, it's someone who was born there, living elsewhere, who comes back and disrupts things because they're highly respected, but they are not often they've become in some ways urbanized and have gained other ideas about what is best. And so it's a really big challenge for us. And what we recommend is that if someone is not living in the community as their primary place of residence, that they do not have as much of a say in community decisions. But I would love to actually have a discussion about that at the end of this presentation.
Marina,
okay,
I want to jump in and just point out that we're running low on time. We're going to have to end on the hour, or at least allow people to get on with their busy days. Those who want to stay on and continue talking, we can do that. But I do want to, be respectful of people's time. So maybe we can plan to, keep an eye on these questions and talk about them at the end, and allow Rachel to continue and get through the rest of her presentation.
I have about 12 more minutes, and then we'll have a little bit time for questions. Does that work, Tobias?
Yeah, and then I'll need a few minutes to wrap up at the end as well. So we'll stop, maybe 3 minutes before the end, and then we can go back to have a broader conversation with people who want to stick around to do that. So
Excellent.
press on.
Okay. Also, am I speaking too fast? If people can let me know if I'm going too fast. I tried to write out everything in case my speech is too fast, but if people want me to slow down, just indicate that, and Marina, jump in and let me know.
Yeah, jump into the question if she's speaking too fast or too slow. I think you're doing a great job so far. Everything.
Okay, thank you.
And please keep the questions coming. Feel free to post questions as we go, and I'm keeping track of them. So thank you.
Fantastic. So the most important part of the community land protection process, the heart of our work, is strengthening community governance of lands and resources. And this work addresses three key challenges. The first one is it's incredibly dangerous to give communities documentation of their land rights without creating accountability for their leaders and strengthening governance. There is nothing worse than a corrupt leader with a title to community lands. As many of you know, sometimes corrupt chiefs or leaders will take those titles and immediately transact them or use them for their personal gain. And so it's really critical that communities put in strong accountability mechanisms for their leaders and take active part in local land governance in order to make community land documentation a benefit for the community and not a disaster. The second challenge is that unwritten rules can be manipulated by the powerful to claim or transact land without community approval, or to dispossess more vulnerable community members from their lands. And so we found that in many of the communities we were working in, there were all these unwritten oral traditions, which are wonderful, but when land becomes scarce or land becomes more valuable, people in power can say, oh, it's our tradition that this and this and this. It's our tradition that leaders get to make unilateral decisions. It's our tradition that women must be dispossessed from their land when their husbands die. And so we wanted to write down and capture the customary rules so they could be looked at critically and that the entire community would know what they are and make sure they're applied justly and equitably. And finally, inter-community discrimination, weakening the land rights of women and minority groups. A lot of customary rules or indigenous rules are not very equitable. And so we wanted to create a space for the community to sit and discuss these rules and think about whether that was really how they wanted to treat each other and whether they wanted such injustices to continue to occur among their family and friends and within their community. So we developed this process for strengthening governance that includes drafting bylaws for good governance of community lands and resources, making a zoning plan that linked the rules to the landscape, and finally, electing land governance councils. The bylaws drafting process is very long. Sometimes it can take 3 months, sometimes it can take 9 months, but the very first step is gathering the community together and brainstorming or shouting out all their existing customs and practices and rules and all of the rules from the past that their ancestors used that were good. And this is a very, very exciting meeting. People really love it. The facilitators will go up and have big pieces of paper and say, okay, what are all your existing rules you have now for governance? What are your existing rules you have now for stewardship of land and resources and sustainable management of your lands and resources? And finally, what are your rules, your cultural rules or your social rules? After they brainstorm this huge list, and it's really a very exciting time, full of memories and excited recounting of cultural traditions and things that their ancestors used to do that worked really well that had fallen out of practice. Then we give them legal education about national laws and human rights laws and then we say, okay, we're going to leave you to look at your existing rules and think about what human rights laws say, what the national laws say, and think about what you want to add to your rules to make them appropriate for today's day and age where there's investors, there's land grabs, there's different laws on the books about equality between men and women. And what rules do you want to get rid of? And what rules do you need to keep but change a little bit? And we leave them to debate and debate their rules for as long as they need to until they get to a second draft. And along the way, the facilitators are convening meetings to help people understand about women's rights, about zoning, about transparent financial management, and other necessary topics. When the community finishes its second draft, they then provide the draft to the facilitating NGO, and the NGO will take it to a lawyer or a judge and say, please do a check to make sure this will align with the national law. And then once the community makes any revisions that violate the law, they have a good third draft, and they convene a giant adoption ceremony where we try to get almost every single household in the community to come to that ceremony. Sometimes we've had ceremonies with 800 people there where they slaughter a cow and have a giant celebration with singing and dancing and performance, and then they adopt their bylaws by either consensus or supermajority vote. And then finally, we recommend that exactly at that meeting, the community elects their land governance council using their new bylaws. The bylaw structure, Marina, I don't know if you can point out what pages this is in the book, but the bylaw structure, we suggested quite a lot of questions to ask communities, or to even just give them that suggested list of questions so that they can think about rules for community definition, rules for land ownership or land holding or land stewardship, how to form their land governance council, what are the rules for the council, how the community is going to make decisions about their lands and resources, what are the rights of women and minority groups and youth, how are they going to keep their documents safe once they get a title or a certificate of registration, how are they going to prepare for future interactions with investors, and finally, how are they going to manage their financial resources. And there's a whole bunch of other rules about land and natural resource governance that communities should think of, but this is an overarching list. And I just want to say for a minute that we created this outline because it's a challenge, because if you give a community too much structure, they'll just follow the structure and not have a critical thinking process of their own. But at the same time, it's important to make sure that they actually touch on a lot of these points. So that list of questions we have in the guide is meant to really support communities to be comprehensive, but to not dictate what they need to make rules for. The rest of the bylaws should also touch on use and management of natural resources, including food resources, water, community forests and grazing lands, hunting and gathering, harvesting and rules for harvesting and gathering resources, rules for sacred areas, cultural areas, protected areas, etc. Commercial use of community resources, like if people are doing alluvial mining or like small-scale timber production or brick making, what are the rules for those people practicing those livelihoods? Finally, a zoning plan, an ecosystem regeneration plan, and then finally, social and cultural rules. So good practices for bylaws drafting. Let the community set the pace, and oftentimes we've seen NGOs say, okay, we'll just do this bylaws in 2 or 3 meetings, no problem. But the problem is if you go in with a template, or if you tell the community they have a month to figure this out, the rich, inclusive, really intense debates that need to come out to truly create local change won't happen. And NGOs are on their time schedule, they've got their donor requirements, and that's just not how communities work. The communities have to be allowed to truly debate this until they come to a real understanding of the changes they want to make to their existing rules. Let the community determine the content, and especially make sure that the bylaws are written in the community's own words and not legalese. We've seen NGOs that will let the community have this super exciting debate, and then the NGOs will go and rewrite the rule that was decided upon in the most arcane legal language, heretofore it is no longer permitted to, whatever, instead of don't dump chemicals in the river. So it's really important that the rules are written in the community's own language, in their own phrasing, and what we found is that government officials have no problem with that. It's actually sort of NGOs' conceptions of things need to be more formal, which may not always be true. And then also handle the process of writing down customary rules very carefully. If women are silent, if minority groups are silent, if that super brilliant old elder woman is in the corner not saying anything, but she's actually a keeper of traditional knowledge, if she's not speaking, those are the kinds of things that it's worrisome if those people are quiet, because they might be holding rules and keeping practices that need to be captured. So it's very important to make sure everyone is speaking, everyone is offering up what they think should be the new rules or the amended rules for the community, and to write down everything. And then a big piece of this is really working with leaders along the way to make sure that they don't feel like their power is being taken from them and they're not being disenfranchised or pushed aside. Because what we've found is if they don't feel listened to, when the NGO leaves, all of the work may be undone. They're like, yeah, we did that whole exercise for the NGO, but we're still the leaders and we're still going to make the decisions around here. And so if facilitating NGOs don't set the community up to really make sure their leaders are enforcing the bylaws and implementing them after the process is over, a lot of this work may be in vain. So potential outcomes of the bylaws, what we've seen is that it really does result in protections for women's and minority groups' rights, increased downward accountability of leaders, greater democratic participation by community members in land and natural resource management decisions, increased conservation and sustainable natural resource management, alignment of customary rules with national law, and setting up the community for strong future prosperity. I'm going to go pretty quickly through the next slides because I'm aware we're out of time soon. But Ensuring long-term implementation and enforcement of the bylaws has proven to be a serious challenge for some of the reasons I just described, particularly on the part of the local leaders. So we've created a number of solutions to ensure that bylaws are implemented over time. First of all, make sure that the rules reflect the community's will and not just the leader's will. But also involve all leaders, especially those that arbitrate land conflicts. We forgot in some of the communities early on to make sure that people who are the ones that are adjudicating family land conflicts are also involved in every step of the bylaws drafting process, because that's in some ways where the rubber hits the road, where when there's a conflict, what rules are applied to the conflict. Make sure the bylaws are widely known, and here's a picture of like posting the bylaws publicly, putting a sign saying no dumping chemicals next to the little lake there in that community. Use the media, use public radio, have teachers teach the bylaws in school to young children. Give copies to local officials and judges and invite them to help support the enforcement. Create a list of practical next steps to make the bylaws real, like what committee is going to make signs and post them at the entrance to certain sacred sites to make sure no one goes in. Who's going to post signs to say, don't take more from the forest than you're going to use, et cetera, et cetera. You can also create watchdog groups that allow certain community members to walk around and make sure that no one is violating the rules. And especially making a plan that includes how the community is going to manage any fees or fines collected for breaking rules or for using community resources. And then finally, most importantly, holding annual, highly participatory meetings every year to look at the bylaws and amend them as necessary. People often ask me, like, if a community is going to write down its customary rules, that means they're going to calcify, they're going to become stagnant and stuck. And that's not how customary rules work. They need to flow and change over time. And the answer is absolutely. And so communities should be encouraged to sit down every single year and see how their bylaws are working and how they can improve upon them. Finally, step 3 of the process, sorry, there's 5 steps. So halfway through, step 3 of the process is harmonizing boundaries and documenting community lands. And there's 2 main challenges that arise here. The first one is long-standing inter-community boundary conflicts can really obstruct the land protection process. And secondly, what we found is even in communities that say they have completely peaceful relations with their neighbors, the process can actively create boundary disputes. People will be like, yeah, we've got no problems, we're totally cool with our neighbors. And then the process of actually documenting and finalizing boundaries, suddenly little land conflicts will flare up all along the way. So we've designed this 3-part process that includes the community making sketch maps of its lands, and then making a note on the sketch maps where there are hotspots or potential conflicts, and then sitting down with their neighbors to talk about the boundaries, and sometimes walk the boundaries and go to the location of the hotspot and sit and talk about it. And that's a very serious conflict resolution process that can take anywhere from 1 month to 2 years, depending on how intractable the conflict is. And then finally, documenting the agreed boundaries, planting boundary trees to create physical evidence on the landscape that are culturally appropriate. For example, in Liberia, they use soap trees, which are fire resistant. And in Uganda, they use the omaramara tree, which you can cut and just cut a branch off of and plant it in the ground like a fence, and it'll grow. Also signing memorandums of understandings with neighbors to create a paper record of what was agreed. So not only creating evidence on the landscape, but also making a contract between the communities to say, we have agreed that this is the boundary we all are abiding by. And then finally making a digital map agreed by everyone. And Marina just got back from 2.5 weeks in Kenya, where she was trying out all these super exciting new mapping technologies to help communities do satellite mapping and digital mapping. And I would love for you to ask her questions about that in a few minutes. I'm going to skip some of these and just say that we found that in terms of resolving land conflicts that occurred during boundary harmonization, it's really important to form a diverse boundary harmonization team. And that is because sometimes elders can be very, very wise about the history of the boundary, but also unwilling to compromise. Whereas youth, when they're on the team, can often say, okay, yes, we hear you, elders, but can we get to a solution here? Let's figure out ways to be more flexible and find a way that we can make something that works. And often we've found women are actually fantastic mediators of conflicts. So it's really excellent. The more diverse the boundary harmonization team, the better the work goes. We found, like these pictures show, go to the physical site of the conflict and focus only on the area that's in dispute, and have the community sit there at the place where the conflict is and tell the history of the boundary. How did this boundary come to be here? For example, we have a story that's in the guide about these two communities in Mozambique, Paindani and Gikonele Gifugo, where they were going around the boundary and having, working through their conflicts, and they got to the beachfront, and both communities said, "This is our land, absolutely." And we sat down and the facilitator said, "Why? Let's talk about the history." And one community said to the other, that rock out there in the ocean is where our ancestors have always gone to do our spiritual practices and do our rituals. Why are you saying this is your beach? Like, that's where we go to do our spiritual work. And the other leaders said, "Well, yes, you're right, we did know that." And it turns out there was an investor that wanted that beachfront area, and so the other community wanted to claim the beachfront so it could potentially reap the benefits of the investor. And so by going back to the history of the conflict, of the boundary formation, that's how they were able to resolve it. And we also urge communities to remember ties with their neighbors and focus on getting to workable compromises. What we've seen is that communities that are willing to sacrifice a few meters so they can document the whole community are very much able to harmonize their boundaries, whereas other communities that are absolutely determined to never compromise, they often get stuck forever and are unable to document their boundaries and get a document. Finally, step 4 is completing government registration procedures, pursuing registration of the claims. And what we've found here is that it's actually a very, very hard process. We've been working in Uganda since 2009, and just a few months ago, our partner LEMU got the very first Community Land Association registration certificates in the entire country ever issued, even though the law was passed in 1997. So it took 7 years of intense work to get the government to actually issue the Communal Land Association certificates. And so it's a very hard process sometimes. And so we have a couple of points here, which is that allow communities to choose their registration goals. If they don't want a title, if they're not into formal ownership, if a title feels like something that's been imposed by the colonizer, then you don't have to make them do that. If some communities really want a title and some communities really don't, and so really let them choose. Although we do suggest to double lock it. The more the community can get a formal title or a piece of paper from the government recognizing their land claims, the better in this modern era of land grabs. But another thing we want to say is that if national laws do not allow for formal registration, you can have the community draft their bylaws and get them signed by local officials, make digital maps, plan boundary trees, sign MOUs with neighbors. Those things may create enough paper documentation to actually prove the community's land claims in a more formal setting. We had a situation in Liberia where there was this massive land sale scandal preceding the last election. And one of our communities had done its bylaws and drawn maps of its land. And so when people came to say, "Oh, we actually, your leaders sold us this giant piece of forest," the community was able to show its bylaws to local government officials and say, "Actually, we zoned that as a group as a reserve forest that's not to be sold." And on the strength of the bylaws alone, the deal was voided and canceled, and the land returned to the community. So originally we said, okay, we're done. The community got their legal documentation, they have maps of their land, they have bylaws for improved governance. But the community said to us, wait a second, what now? We're still poor, we still have trouble accessing markets and bringing our goods to market. We still have trouble getting credit for starting small businesses. What's going on? You can't just leave us. Like, nothing's changing except we have this title or this registration certificate. And we also saw that community leaders were still making backroom deals with investors and still managing their money in non-transparent ways. I'm aware that I have 2 minutes left, and we have 2 more slides, so I just want to let you guys know that. Tobias, you can interrupt me and let me know if I just need to stop as a hard line.
All right, well, Rachel, why don't we stop for just a moment and let me say last closing remarks for people who need to leave, which is basically the important thing to note is that this is all being recorded, so people can come back later and catch up if they need to leave right now. And this is part of a process. Basically, what's next? There's going to be a post-webinar survey as soon as you leave the webinar. It's very brief, and it helps you to give feedback to Rachel and her team. So please complete that survey, and it is a great way for you to immediately give her feedback and also share immediate ideas for how you might use and share the guide. And then you can also connect with us by email after the webinar, and we'll be in touch with you by email immediately after. And with the recording as well as soon as we have it, so that you can share it and access the recording. And then the network team, these webinars are part of what the Global Legal Empowerment Network does. This is how we meet and collaborate. But we also have an online networking platform, and we'd really like to see everyone here join the network, update your profiles, and connect with fellow practitioners. We have a discussion platform, and we also organize learning exchanges, offline learning opportunities. But to benefit from those, you really need to join the network and become part of our community. So with that, I want to bid farewell to anyone who needs to leave right now, and then give the floor back to Rachel, who can wrap up her presentation in a relaxed manner.
I started going really fast.
And then we can also maybe address more of your questions. And even if we don't manage to address questions today, it's so great to have them, and do consider this part of an ongoing conversation that we can be having. And with all of you, and it's a collaborative, ongoing process that we're part of today. So go ahead, Rachel, and continue.
I just have 2 more slides. So, as I said before, we thought we were done. The community had their bylaws, their maps. They had a new land governance council that included women and youth and members of minority groups. But the communities were very clear that they wanted more support to be able to allow them to leverage their lands and natural resources to really bring in future prosperity, and allow them to flourish and thrive. So we created this last step about supporting communities to prosper. And this part of the process involves preparing communities for potential negotiations with investors who may arrive seeking lands and resources, creating livelihood support, so linking the community to NGOs and other supports that might be able to help them access microcredit or learn new livelihood skills or figure out how to bring their goods to market, and also supporting communities to regenerate the local ecosystem. And by this, we did some research into basic permaculture techniques about water catchment. How do you help communities catch rainwater before it drains away and stop erosion? Planting more trees, very basic tools that communities can use without having to spend a lot of money. And how to, for example, also how to increase the fertility of the soil so they're able to grow more abundant foods and resources without using a ton of chemical fertilizers, etc. And then supporting the community to return to their original vision with an action plan. So with that work, we actually asked the community to think back to the vision they had for their desired future and then make a step-by-step plan for how they can get there. And then finally, we had added financial management trainings and added them to this part of the process. But we found that it was really important to do them during the bylaws work so they could start putting in rules in their bylaws for better financial management. But we often found that because the leaders were still doing these sort of dirty dealings with the community money that was coming in, or not very transparent with it, we urge a continued review of transparent financial management to make sure that any money that does come into the community is used towards the community vision and the action plan. There's a 10-page chapter in the guide about supporting communities approached by potential investors. It goes on, and I just wanted to pull out a few things so you can understand, by example, how intensively the guide goes into some of these instructions. So we have a 9-point plan to teach communities how to prepare for potential investors. And the first one is to make sure communities know their rights under national and international laws, including demanding FPIC, which is free, prior, informed consent, or demanding an environmental, social, or human rights impact assessment, as well as any other laws that are applicable to how they can defend and protect their land rights if an investor came. Finally, second, preparing communities for future interactions with investors during the bylaws process, so that their bylaws set out clear rules for how their leaders should interact the moment that an investor shows up in the community asking for land, which include, for example, saying that 2/3 of the community at least must agree to an investor's plan before anything is done. So by adding to the bylaws rules that the entire community have to be informed, have to give their consent, that can help create processes that hold leaders and investors accountable. If they're written down in a clear document, communities can say to the investor, hey, these are our rules, why don't you read them, and you need to follow them. Preparing communities to plan in advance what rent and benefits to request if they do decide to welcome an investor. So we found that communities will often ask for a one-time request of build a school or build a road or build a clinic, but they don't really think about what materials is the school going to get built out of, on what timeline, are there going to be books and teachers provided, and not only that, communities need to be asking for annual rent to remunerate them for their resources. Fourth, setting up an early warning system. We pioneered this in Liberia, which is this very basic tool where we created a hotline number essentially for the entire one entire county, and said the minute an investor arrives seeking land, you can call this hotline for immediate legal support. And people started calling the hotline all of the time. And sometimes an investor would go into community, we'd get 4 or 5 different calls saying, hey, this investor just showed up. And on the other side of the hotline is a staff member with an Excel spreadsheet and a list of questions saying, who is the investor representing, what is the business he is wanting to do, did he come with government officials, how much land is he asking for, and collecting information, and then either sending information to the community or sending a staff member directly to the community to help with the process preventatively as soon as possible. Fifth, preparing communities to respond to an investor in an empowered way when they arrive. For example, research everything you can about this investor. Find out what the business plan is. Find out, what is their track record in other nations. Don't sign anything until you've, brought in legal supports, et cetera, et cetera. And then ensuring the community members remember, if they haven't done it already, or understand the value of the resources that they're actually offering, so they can ask for appropriate compensation. And then prepare the communities for negotiation, do trainings and actual negotiation techniques, and have the communities request that nothing gets done in just one meeting, that there's a back and forth process. Communities have the right to request a couple of meetings and give them time to go away and think about what's offered and come back. And then it's absolutely critical that the facilitating organization should provide legal support during the negotiation itself. And then finally, and most importantly, get a good written contract that's enforceable in a court of law. A lot of times investors will come in and just make a bunch of promises and go away with paperwork, and the community doesn't have a piece of anything showing what they've agreed to. And there's no time to look at the contract or look at the paperwork and make sure it's an enforceable contract with penalties if the investor does not do as they say they're going to do, does not fulfill the promises, etc. I already spoke about livelihood support and ecosystem regeneration. I included this picture from China about what is possible with ecosystem regeneration. Communities that use reforestation, water catchment techniques, and holistic range land management, and leverage their traditional knowledge for how to really revive and regenerate their ecosystem, can within the course of a few years bring back fertility to land that looks like it's arid and totally unusable. So that is the end of the presentation. I apologize for going over. I'll open the floor to any questions for anyone who is still here. Thank you all so much. This is my first webinar, and I'm just delighted that you're attending, and very, 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 very excited to offer this guide out into the world.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
That's great.
Super well done. So Marina, go ahead and convey some questions.
Sure, and we still have 56 people on the line, so most of us are still here. So we had some clusters of questions, a bunch of questions about working with leaders, several questions about women and minority groups, and several questions about government involvement. So maybe we'll start with those clusters. Please keep posting questions. I'll monitor them as they come in. So for the first group about working with leaders, we said, what do you do if leaders are autocratic and corrupt and put their own interests before the communities? Or how do you deal with traditional leadership that is profoundly anti-women's rights, especially land rights? Giles Henley also asked, do you think it's possible to assess the balance of power between community members and leaders at the outset as part of the selection process? And finally, Antonio asked, during the process of preparing the ground, how do you ensure that individual land rights within the community are not affected by the whole community's interests, which is defended by local leaders? So how do you balance that, the interests of local leaders and the whole community with individual interests?
Wow, those are a lot of fantastic questions. I'm not sure if I should take them one by one or answer them all together. Working with leaders is really challenging. And just I want to say at the outset that what we found is that communities with strong leaders and united leaders, like that are not fighting between themselves within the community, do so much better. And considering that every NGO has limited capacity, and the fact that so many communities urgently need to document and protect their land rights, that we suggest that as NGOs are beginning this work and starting it for the first time, to pick the low-hanging fruit. Pick the communities where the leaders are strong, they're not corrupt, they're super gung-ho. And if you're just trying out this process for the first time, don't start with the really challenging communities where the leaders are just corrupt and a disaster. And once you figure out the process, then you can move into those more complex communities that obviously need help. And one thing I will say is it's often the communities with the corrupt leadership that need to protect their land the most urgently, because those are the communities where the leaders are making dirty deals or where elites are grabbing land for themselves and there's no internal rule of law. So to answer the question, we really grapple with how to deal with corrupt or sort of just entrenched leaders with really entrenched ideas of their own power. And what we found is that it's important to speak extremely explicitly about this to the leaders themselves and ask them point blank, like, are you willing to make these changes? What are, how willing are you to see a change in the way that decisions are made? And get them to really critically reflect on it. We found it's best to ask them either one-on-one or in a group of leaders only, not in front of community members, to get them a little bit ready before it becomes a community discussion. And then the other thing we've suggested is that we actually, there's something to be said for sort of shaming leaders if the communities are able to do that, which is to have a community discussion about ways they can improve leadership in their community. And we've seen, for example, in Uganda, if people are very unhappy with their leaders, they'll say it straight out, but in a roundabout way, like, our leaders should not be drunkards, or our leaders should not be corrupt, and they'll say that during the bylaws discussion, and then figure out ways to create rules to manage that situation. And it works sometimes, and frankly, it doesn't work sometimes. And it really has to do with the strength of the community members themselves and how willing leaders themselves are to change a little bit. For example, in this one community in Liberia, where the leaders went off at the end of the process and made that dirty deal with the investor, the community actually called a meeting and just yelled at their leaders for the first time ever. Like in that culture in Liberia, it's completely inappropriate to contradict or yell at a leader publicly. But the community was so upset that their leaders had gone against the bylaws and made this deal behind their back that they actually just challenged them directly. And the leaders were so ashamed that they went back to Monrovia and canceled the deal. So a huge piece of it is community empowerment and really supporting open dialogue. I'm not sure if I answered all the questions. Maybe Marina remind me what I didn't touch upon.
Well, I think that's great. I think one of them leads into the next group of topics. So one of the questions was about how do you handle leaders that are profoundly anti-women's rights? And then we had a cluster of other questions about how do you ensure that minority ethnic groups and women are not sidelined during the process? Do you support ways to allow communities to provide consent that are locally accepted, that are, for the sake of inclusivity across gender and different socioeconomic status? We also had a question about how do you ensure women participation in the process where there is strong influence of traditional beliefs that say that women should not be allowed to attend meetings or speak? And finally, Chloe asked, do you recommend specific protections for women within the bylaws process? So maybe we could speak a little bit more specifically about how we handle questions about women and minority groups.
Excellent. I should say that I have like an hour-and-a-half presentation on this topic alone. It's a huge, huge piece of our work, and we spend enormous amounts of time and energy addressing these questions exactly. And I wish I'd had time to go into this in depth, so it's good that we have a set of questions about it.
We can also plan another webinar specifically on some of these topics.
It would be wonderful. So women's rights and the rights of minority groups are one of the founding goals of this program, is that how do we support the community to actually address these issues. And I want to say from the outset that 7 years of work has taught us that custom and tradition and women's rights are absolutely not contradictory. A lot of times custom has gotten calcified into just extremely discriminatory processes or rules and mandates. But often if you go back to the origin of the rule, for example, widow inheritance in Africa, which is the idea that after a man dies, the woman is forced to marry his siblings. That was originally created to make sure the woman could stay on the land and stay part of the family. And so you can ask community members. What we found is if you say to them, like, what are the rationale behind these rules? Why do you have these rules? And engage with them in an open, thoughtful, critical discussion about the original intent of some of rules that now on their face look incredibly horrifying to the modern Western eyes. The community has really good original rationale and reasoning. And so facilitators can take the community back to that reasoning and say, okay, well, that's well and good and important for your culture, but the national law also says women and men are equal and you can't just dispossess women from their land or whatever. How do we find a solution to marry the two? The beautiful intent behind your custom of safekeeping families' land within the family and making sure that women are protected and provided for, but also align with the fact that you cannot just force a woman to marry her in-laws, and you cannot force a woman to leave her land. And so by opening the space for those kind of debates, we find that people are actually far more open to critically reflect on than one would imagine. That's part one. The second piece is that we are very adamant about convening separate meetings for women straight throughout the process and saying, okay, women, like, oftentimes we'll have a community meeting and divide it into men, women, and youth, so those particular interest groups and stakeholder groups can consolidate their opinion. But we also have these special women's conferences during the bylaws process where we urge our partners to have special meetings for women where we say, okay, the bylaws processes are happening. What are your points of advocacy that you want to make it into the bylaws? And by bringing the women together and giving them like an intensive course in their legal rights, and then helping them decide on like an advocacy plan, and then giving them the task of going back to their communities and telling every single woman that wasn't in the meeting about what the plan is and how they should come to the meeting and voice their opinions. The women can then show up as a block in the bylaws meetings and appoint maybe a woman who's fearless or more outspoken to make the points for women who might be afraid to speak. We've also found that talking to men and leaders about women's rights and the importance of strong women's rights in the community actually can help change their mind. And then finally, a piece I want to state is that what we've found over time is that women can show by example how useful they are to land governance, which is that a lot of times women will draw maps of their lands and natural resources, and they'll be far more comprehensive than the men's maps. Women will have no rules for all kinds of natural resources that are the domain of women. And what we've seen over time is that by creating a space for women to speak openly about gendered tasks like gathering water, gathering firewood, things like, and resources that are the domain of women's work, like in some communities it's honey gathering or gathering white ants or traditional medicines. A lot of times those are the domain of women. And so women, when we give a space for women to speak up about the natural resources they know about because they are within their domain of gendered work, the men are like, oh wow, women have all this knowledge and expertise that we don't have because they do different work. If we're truly interested in protecting our lands and resources and managing things sustainably, we need to have women's voices because they have different expertise. And we found this works. Rather than hitting people over the head and saying, you have to listen to women, we create a space where women speak and by example show how critical their impact is. And what we found over time is that the impacts of this work are twofold. Women's rights are actually protected and strengthened in the bylaws, and number two, community members see by women showing it how necessary it is to have women on the land governing body. And so they'll elect women to positions of leadership. A lot of times they'll put in the rules they have to do that, and sometimes it's just national law that women have to be included on these boards, on these bodies. So I'll stop talking there. Is there anything I missed, Marina?
No, I think that sounded great. And again, I mean, we can plan future webinars to go into that in more detail, and the guide has a lot of detailed examples.
I also want to say, well. I just want to say also that it's not perfect, right? Like what we've seen over time is that some communities implement bylaws protecting women's rights and some don't. And that's where it's important to stay engaged with the community over time and check in with them, what bylaws are being implemented, what bylaws aren't being implemented, are women sitting on these bodies but not speaking, et cetera, et cetera. And it's really a massive consciousness changing for the community, particularly on women's rights. And so it's important that facilitators return into these issues and revisit them and think about them and engage the community in critical reflection.
So our other main cluster of questions concerned government involvement. So the questions were, when do you involve government officials in the initial groundwork? And one attendee asked, in the guide, it seems like the role of government is only highlighted at the very end of the process to validate the process by issuing titles. Is there any timeline on how and when to involve government throughout the process? And then Eileen also asked, on the issue of governance, especially the formulation of community bylaws that are eventually certified, at what stage does the process involve ongoing government officials and other government projects?
That is so awesome. I'm actually thinking that in our next version next year we should add an entire chapter on this. Government officials are highlighted in every chapter, but it would be useful to pull it out and make it clear, maybe in the project management section of the guide. So essentially, what we've seen in our work is that government officials are involved from the beginning through the end, and if you don't involve them straight away through, it'll cause massive challenges. So what we usually do is we will have our partners meet with central government officials and get a letter that allows them to meet with local, provincial or district government officials, and then meet with the lowest level of government officials and let everybody know. Ask the government officials advice, make presentations about the work they're planning to do, and then talk to them about the communities they're planning to work in, or ask for their suggestions of communities that they think really need this help. And then what we suggest is that the facilitating NGO make monthly or quarterly presentations to the local government. When we have our partners, when our partners meet with the government very, very regularly and giving them a written paper update of here's what we've accomplished in the past month, or here's what we've accomplished in the past quarter, here's some challenges, here's some solutions, here's some successes, and actively asking for the government officials' feedback, support, ideas, problem-solving thoughts, it really makes them excited in a way that has actually surprised me, is that a lot of local government officials are actually from these communities, and they see the threat to community lands, and a lot of them, far more than central government officials, are very, very excited about this process and thrilled about it if they're not corrupt. We also suggest that at every major celebration, like if the boundaries have been harmonized and there's an MOU signing ceremony, that you actually invite all the local leaders and the provincial leaders and have them sit at the front of the celebration and sign every boundary harmonization MOU, and that you have them be there officiating the bylaws adoption ceremony so that they're made to feel like honored and respected guests that are present at every single moment of celebration. And so that by the time you get to the moment of asking the government to register the lands, the entire local government is like super excited and involved. Also, local government has been absolutely incredibly helpful in resolving land disputes. Oftentimes, it's really important to bring in respected elder statesmen or respected high-level local leaders to help them arbitrate and mediate land conflicts. And so we found that the government officials are not always anti this process. A lot of them are extremely supportive, and the more you weave them in, the more you invite them in, the more you honor their expertise and their position and say, please help us, the more supportive they are. It's actually sometimes the central government that is the most challenging. I don't know if I answered all the questions.
I think that was great. We only have a few more minutes left, but we do have a couple other questions. Should we continue, Rachel?
Sure. I don't know if it's appropriate to have a discussion or if it's just easier for me to keep answering questions.
Yeah, I think let's keep going with some of the questions that were asked.
Okay.
So Keba asked, what happens if the community has a vision for their future that is totally different from the land rights issues or the vision that the NGO is working on?
Oh, I love that question. First of all, we probably wouldn't be working in the community if it didn't actively and aggressively want to protect its land rights. But second of all, most community visions are about health and education and economic development. That's the whole point of the community vision, is they actually want to see the community flourish and thriving. And so their vision is separate from the land rights issue. I often think about people that are going to build schools and clinics everywhere, and sometimes I just think, oh God, why are they building that clinic in that region where a mining company might just come and take the whole land and dispossess the community? And so for us, we think of the land rights question as not the goal, but as the precondition to community development. So the vision is, the land right protection is the piece that allows the future vision to happen. And the vision will be about, healthcare for all, and like thriving schools for their children, and an abundant ecosystem, and all kinds of small-scale livelihood businesses, etc. So it's not contradictory at all.
That's great. And we also have a question from Sankita in Sierra Leone, our colleague at Namati, Sierra Leone. And Sankita asks, how amenable to scale is this approach? Would you recommend it for countries undertaking land reform efforts that seek to document community lands for the first time?
Yes. I mean, scale is really the big question behind this guide, right? It's that it's a really complex process, as you all have just heard. It involves many steps, many activities, and one of my concerns in putting this out there into the world is that people could take this work and sort of do it haphazardly or without intense integrity, and then it'll have really bad results. Like I said, is that if a community starts this process and starts trying to harmonize its boundaries, and all these 10 boundary conflicts flare up, and then the NGO is like, oh, well, we got to go. Or if they just, sometimes people will come to a community and say, here's some good bylaws, just sign them. So, that won't work either. And so in terms of scaling this, we've been able to make this process part and parcel of Liberia's draft Land Rights Act, actually. Our years of experimentation, we've been working with the government every step of the way before we even started, quarterly presentations to central government officials, the Land Commission, and the process we innovated is now actually the process enshrined in the draft bill. I also was invited to Kenya since 2010, and in the earlier drafts of the Kenyan bill, this process was very much integrated in, although the executive branch recently eliminated most of it. So the idea would be for advocates to take a process like this that's super focused on community governance and participatory governance over their lands and help integrate it into national laws and regulations. And then the point of the guide is that you can, translate it into the local language and let communities themselves try it out, get local government officials to help implement this work, get NGOs and civil society to help implement it. One real beautiful moment just happened to us recently. We were talking to our new partner in Zambia. We're like, oh, so you're going to do visioning next week. Like, do you want any support for that? And they're like, oh, no, we know what to do. We read about it in the guide. And we were like, great, go for it. So in terms of happening at scale, that's one of the reasons we're trying to publish this, which is that how can we get people to understand the full scope of the work and take it on without having to talk to Numati? While we're here for technical support, anyone should be able to go in and help facilitate these super low-cost activities. One of the things I wanted to say, and I forgot to say, which is that we found that this costs roughly $5,000 per community, which is a massively cheap cost if there's thousands of community members. And that cost is usually just petrol and transportation and the cost of the staff time, frankly. I'll stop there.
I think that's a great note to actually wrap up the webinar, because we're just at time. So Rachel, if you wanted to have any closing words.
I'm just so thrilled that so many people stayed on for so long, and I'm just absolutely delighted and honored to share this super exciting work with you guys. And like I said, our goal is to let this work go out into the world now and be bigger than Numati and be bigger than anything we and our partners could do, and to really seed thousands of communities to be able to protect their lands over time and really take on the global land grab from the grassroots, driven by communities who are working to revitalize their ecosystems and their cultures and claim their lands and stand up and be empowered and take on corrupt government officials and giant global investors and win. So that's one of our hopes, and I'm thrilled to have you all here learning about this guide, and it's a delight to put it out into the world. It's a culmination of a lot of work and a lot of energy, so thank you all.
Wow, thank you so much, Rachel. And wow, that's a really, really great note to end on. Really appreciate your candid presentation today. And Marina, also thank you so much for fielding the questions in such a capable way. I really like the way you organize them into groups like this. So as you leave, everyone, please take the survey. Help us, engage with us, connect with us. We'll be in touch tomorrow with a post-webinar follow-up note and link to the recording. Please join the network, engage with us also in the network, update your profiles, add your organizations, and tell us what you're working on and how you're going to use the guide. Thanks, everyone, so much, and look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.